January 1870, Brooklyn waterfront. The air smelled of coal smoke, fish, and sewage from the East River. Outside a wooden construction office, a hand-painted sign read, Brooklyn Bridge Company, laborers wanted, $2.50 per day, hard labor, river work, inquire within. $2.50 was good money, nearly double what a factory worker made, nearly triple what a dock laborer earned. For the Irish immigrants fresh off ships from famine-ravaged counties, for German workers fleeing political upheaval, for former slaves trying to build lives in a country that barely acknowledged their freedom, that sign might as well have been printed in gold. Inside, the foreman was direct. The work is underwater, 70 feet down. You'll be working inside a wooden box we're sinking into the riverbed. The air will be compressed to keep the water out. It's hot, it's dark, it's dangerous. Some men don't handle it well, but if you can manage a full shift, you'll take home wages. That'll feed your family for a week. Interested? Most men said yes, because when you're desperate enough, dangerous becomes negotiable. When your children are hungry, hot and dark become acceptable. When the alternative is watching your family starve, working 70 feet underwater in a pressurized wooden box doesn't sound insane. It sounds like opportunity. What the foreman didn't mention was what happened to your body under that kind of pressure. What he didn't explain was the physics of gases dissolved in blood. What he couldn't tell you, because nobody understood it yet, was that the real danger wasn't the descent into darkness. It was coming back up into the light. On your first day, you signed a paper you probably couldn't read, disclaiming the company from responsibility for injury or death. You were given a metal tag with a number, not a name, a number, because names were for people the company intended to remember. You stripped down to minimal clothing because you'd been told it got hot below. Then you followed the other workers toward a steel door built into a wooden structure that looked like a massive shed sitting at the river's edge. The door opened. Inside was a chamber barely 10 feet square, with riveted steel walls, and another door on the opposite side. 8 men crowded in. The outer door sealed behind you with a sound like a prison cell closing. A valve opened somewhere above. You heard hissing. Then you felt it. Pressure. Not pushing against your skin, but pushing into your skull. Your ears felt like someone was driving needles through your eardrums. You tried to swallow. It helped for a second. Then the pain returned worse than before. Your jaw ached. Your sinuses felt like they were being crushed. You tried to breathe and discovered that pulling air into your lungs required effort, like breathing through wet cloth. The experienced workers around you worked their jaws constantly, swallowing, yawning, anything to equalize the pressure, building inside their heads. One man grabbed your shoulder and shouted something, but his voice sounded strange, higher-pitched, like a child's voice. You tried to respond and heard your own voice come out squeaky and distorted. The air itself felt wrong, thick, almost liquid in your throat. 5 minutes of this. The gauge on the wall climbed, 10 pounds per square inch above atmospheric pressure, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. Your body was being subjected to more than twice the pressure it was designed to handle. Your ears popped violently. Blood vessels in your eyes felt ready to burst. Then, finally, the hissing stopped. The inner door opened. Heat rolled out like opening an oven. 100 degrees, maybe more, with humidity at 100%. A ladder descended into darkness, broken only by the dim yellow glow of oil lamps far below. You climbed down, 40 feet of ladder, rungs slick with condensation and oil. With each step down, the temperature climbed. 80 degrees, 90, 100, 110. At the bottom, you stepped into hell. If stories like this move you, if you believe the men who built our world deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as human beings who suffered and died for structures we take for granted, I would be grateful if you could subscribe to this channel. Let me know in the comments which engineering disasters or forgotten industrial stories I should investigate next. Your support helps preserve the history of people whose names were never meant to be remembered. Now, let's go back to the beginning, back to before the first worker descended, back to when a Prussian immigrant engineer sketched something the world had never seen at this scale and decided that the distance between vision and reality could be measured in human suffering. Part 2 begins. The Roebling Vision and Caisson Engineering. John Augustus Roebling was born in Mühlhausen, Prussia, in 1806. He studied philosophy under Hegel and engineering at the Royal Polytechnic Institute in Berlin, where he became fascinated with suspension bridges, a relatively new technology at the time. In 1831, he immigrated to America with dreams of building things Europe couldn't imagine. He started with wire rope, founding a company that would dominate the industry. Then he turned to bridges. By the 1860s, Roebling had built suspension bridges across the Allegheny River, the Niagara Gorge, and the Ohio River at Cincinnati. Each one pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. But his vision for Brooklyn was different. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a statement, a declaration, that American engineering could surpass anything Europe had achieved. The numbers were staggering. The main span would stretch 1,595 feet between towers, making it the longest suspension bridge in the world by a massive margin. The towers themselves would rise 276 feet above the water, taller than any building in New York at the time. And those towers, each one, would need to support over 14,000 tons of dead load from the bridge deck, cables, and traffic, forever. The challenge was the East River itself. It wasn't just water, it was a tidal strait with currents reaching 6 miles per hour during peak flow. Winter brought ice formations that could crush wooden pilings like matchsticks. Ships needed clearance beneath, which meant the towers had to be massive and the foundations absolutely immovable. And beneath the river was 78 feet of water on the Brooklyn side, maybe more on the Manhattan side, with another 30 feet of mud, debris, and sediment below that before reaching bedrock. Conventional pile driving wouldn't work. The mud was too deep, the bedrock too far down, and the river too violent. Roebling studied European engineering reports on pneumatic caissons, massive wooden chambers that could be sunk to bedrock, using compressed air to keep water out while men excavated from inside. The technology had been used for smaller harbor works and bridge piers in France and England, but nothing at this scale, nothing this deep, nothing with this much weight pressing down from above. Roebling designed caissons that defied belief. The Brooklyn side caisson measured 168 feet long and 102 feet wide. That's bigger than most city blocks. It would be built entirely from yellow pine timber, some pieces 15 inches thick, laminated in layers to create a roof strong enough to support the granite tower being built on top of it. The finished caisson would weigh over 3,000 tons before a single stone was laid. The working chamber inside, where men would excavate, was only 9.5 feet high. You couldn't stand fully upright. The space was designed for efficiency, not comfort. 6 airlocks would allow workers to enter and exit. Supply, shafts, would remove excavated material, and the entire structure would be pressurized to whatever level was necessary to keep the East River from flooding in and drowning everyone inside. The principle was elegant in theory. Build the massive wooden box on shore, launch it like a ship, and float it into position. Begin piling granite blocks on the roof, which would become the foundation of the tower. As the weight increased, the caisson would sink into the riverbed, pump compressed air into the working chamber to create pressure equal to the water pressure outside. Men inside would excavate mud and rock from beneath the caisson. As they dug, the caisson would sink deeper, continue until bedrock, then fill the entire chamber with concrete, seal it forever, and you have a foundation that will never move. But the pressure equation was unforgiving. Every 33 feet of depth required roughly 15 pounds per square inch of air pressure inside the chamber. At 78 feet, the working pressure would exceed 35 psi. For context, that's higher than the air pressure in most car tires. Workers would be living inside an overinflated tire for 6 to 8 hours at a time, breathing air so dense it changed the physics of sound and combustion. Construction of the Brooklyn caisson began in the spring of 1869. It took months to build, a massive undertaking involving hundreds of carpenters working in shifts. Newspapers covered the progress with fascination. Engineers came from across the country to observe. It was launched in March of 1870, floated into position, and the first granite blocks were set on top. As the weight grew, the caisson began its descent into the mud. But John Augustus Roebling never saw it sink. While surveying the bridge site in June of 1869, his foot was crushed between a ferry and the dock pilings. The injury became infected. Tetanus set in. He refused most medical treatment, believing in water, cure therapy, and other remedies that proved useless against bacterial infection. He died on July 22, 1869, 2 weeks after the accident, in excruciating pain. He was 63 years old. His masterpiece had barely begun. His son, Washington Roebling, 32 years old, and a veteran of the Civil War, where he'd built military bridges under fire at Gettysburg, became chief engineer. Washington had worked alongside his father for years and understood the design intimately. But understanding a design on paper and experiencing its reality are very different things. Washington Roebling made it a point to go down into the caisson himself before sending crews into extended shifts. His written account of that first descent is preserved in the Roebling family archives. He described the moment the airlock door opened and pressure hit him like a physical blow. His ears felt as though needles were being driven through the eardrums. The air was so dense he could barely draw breath. Lamp flames burned unnaturally bright, consuming oil at twice the normal rate. Candles were almost useless, burning away in minutes instead of hours. The heat was oppressive. The darkness beyond the lamplight was absolute, and beneath his feet, mud stretched down into unknown depth. Washington's conclusion, written in his journal that evening, was simple and prophetic. This will be the hardest work any man has ever attempted. He was right, but even he, with his engineering education and military experience, didn't understand just how hard it would be, because the men who descended into that darkness weren't just fighting mud and rock and heat, they were fighting physics itself, and physics always wins. Work began in earnest in May of 1870. The first crews descended, and what happened over the next 2.5 years would change our understanding of human physiology, rewrite the rules of underwater construction, and kill or permanently injure hundreds of men whose names history never bothered to record. Part 3 begins, inside the caisson, the physics of hell. The descent became a ritual every worker learned to dread. You arrived topside at shift change, 6 in the morning or 6 in the evening. The work ran continuously, 24 hours a day when conditions allowed. You stripped down to pants and an undershirt. Some men worked in even less. The heat below made additional clothing unbearable, and wet fabric against compressed air created conditions for hypothermia when you surfaced. You carried your tools, a water canteen that would be empty within an hour, and nothing else. The outer airlock door opened. 8 to 10 men crowded into a space barely large enough for half that number. The door sealed behind you with heavy bolts that reminded everyone this was a pressure vessel, and if something went wrong, the explosion would kill you before you felt pain. A valve opened above. Compressed air flooded the chamber with a hiss that climbed to a roar. The pain started immediately. Your ears felt the pressure first, because the eustachian tubes, those tiny passages connecting your middle ear to your throat, couldn't equalize fast enough. Experienced workers knew to swallow constantly, work their jaw muscles, yawn repeatedly, anything to open those tubes and let pressure equalize. New workers didn't know this. Many ruptured their eardrums on the first descent. You'd see blood coming from their ears, mixing with the sweat that was already pouring from everyone in the confined heating chamber. The pressure gauge climbed, 10 psi, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. Your sinuses, those air pockets in your skull, compressed painfully. Headaches formed instantly, deep throbbing pressure behind your eyes and across your forehead. Breathing required conscious effort. Each inhalation pulled against external pressure, trying to collapse your chest. Your lungs worked harder for less oxygen because, although the air was denser, the concentration of oxygen per breath remained the same. And your voice changed. The dense air altered the speed of sound traveling through it. Everyone sounded higher-pitched, almost comical, like cartoon characters. Grown men sounded like children. Words became harder to form clearly. Shouting was necessary to be heard over the roar of incoming air, but shouting in that dense atmosphere exhausted you quickly. The procedure called for 10 minutes of pressurization to allow bodies to adjust. The reality was 5 minutes or less. Foremen were under constant pressure from company supervisors to maximize productive work time. Every minute spent in pressurization or decompression was a minute not excavating, so they rushed it. The gauge climbed faster than safety demanded. Men gritted their teeth and endured because complaining got you replaced. Finally, the hissing stopped. Pressure equalized. The inner door opened and heat rolled out like a physical force. The ladder descended 40 feet into darkness that looked like the entrance to hell. You climbed down, hands slipping on rungs coated with condensation and oil. The temperature climbed with every rung. By the time you reached the bottom, it was over 110 degrees with 100% humidity. At the bottom of the ladder, you stepped into the working chamber, 168 feet long, 102 feet wide, only 9.5 feet from floor to ceiling, supported by timber columns every 6 feet that groaned constantly under the thousands of tons pressing down from above. The floor was rough planks over mud that was never dry. Water seeped constantly despite the air pressure. The mud beneath was mixed with sewage because the East River was New York's sewer system in 1870. The air was thick with smoke from oil lamps because there was no ventilation except through the airlocks. The smoke never fully cleared. It coated your lungs. Within an hour, you were coughing up black phlegm. Some men developed what they called caisson cough, a deep rattling in the chest that never went away. Years later, after the bridge was finished, men would still wake up at night coughing, tasting that smoke in their throats. Sound traveled strangely in the dense air. Voices were muffled and distorted. The impact of picks and shovels on mud echoed metallically off the timber ceiling. And beneath everything was the constant groaning of the caisson structure itself. Timber adjusting under pressure, beams flexing, joints creaking. Workers learned to distinguish normal creaking from danger. Creaking. A certain pitch meant a timber was about to crack. A certain rhythm meant a support column was shifting. When you heard those sounds, you moved, quickly. The work itself was brutal in its simplicity. Dig the mud, load it into buckets, haul the buckets to supply shafts, where water pressure differentials sucked the material up to the surface. Repeat for 6 to 8 hours straight. The mud was thick, heavy, and mixed with debris, broken glass, metal fragments, pieces of ships that had sunk decades earlier, dead animals that had decomposed into the riverbed. Sharp objects were everywhere. Cuts were constant. And cuts in that environment, exposed to sewage-contaminated mud and the bacteria thriving in the heat, infected almost immediately. Tetanus was a constant threat. Remember that John Augustus Roebling, the man who designed this bridge, died of tetanus from a crushed foot. Every worker knew that story. Every worker knew that a simple cut could kill you days later when your muscles seized and you died in convulsions. But there was no choice. You couldn't wear heavy gloves in that heat. You couldn't work slowly to avoid cuts. The pace was relentless. Foremen watched constantly from elevated platforms. Anyone slowing down was noted. Fall behind the expected pace too many times and you were replaced. There were hundreds of men waiting topside for jobs. You were expendable. The caisson had to sink inches per day minimum to stay on schedule. Your exhaustion, your pain, your safety meant nothing compared to that schedule. The excavation revealed obstacles regularly. Beneath the mud were boulders, some weighing multiple tons, remnants of shipwrecks, timber pilings from old dock structures. Occasionally, human remains from bodies dumped in the river over the centuries. When boulders were too large to move, the solution was to blast them with black powder. Think about that for a moment. Black powder explosives, in a pressurized chamber, with open flame oil lamps everywhere, with dozens of men working in confined space. The procedure was to drill holes into the boulder by hand, pack the powder, light a fuse, and evacuate everyone to the upper section of the chamber where the ceiling was slightly higher. In theory, this provided protection. In reality, there wasn't enough space and there wasn't enough time. Explosions in compressed air behaved differently than explosions at normal pressure. The concussion was amplified. The sound was magnified to levels that ruptured eardrums. Flying rock fragments in a confined space became shrapnel. Several men died this way, crushed by debris that should have been harmless, but became lethal projectiles under pressure. Others survived, but were deafened permanently. Eardrums blown out by concussion waves their bodies weren't designed to withstand. And there were creatures in the mud. The East River wasn't sterile. Workers encountered eels, some as long as 6 feet, that attacked when disturbed. Crabs with claws that could break fingers. Rats that had burrowed through from sewers and thrived in the darkness, warmth, and food scraps workers brought down. One account from a worker named Patrick Delaney describes an eel wrapping around his leg and biting through his pant fabric into his calf. He killed it with a shovel, but the bite became infected. He lost the leg 3 weeks later to gangrene. Some workers claimed to hear sounds beyond the caisson walls, movement in the mud, scratching, shifting. It was probably just sediment settling, rock fragments grinding against timber as the caisson sank. Probably. But in that darkness, in that heat, after hours of exhausting labor, with your mind starting to play tricks from the pressure, those sounds felt like something alive, something waiting. The shifts were officially 6 hours, but often extended to 8 or more if work fell behind schedule. There were no breaks. You ate if you brought food, but the heat made appetite vanish. You drank constantly from your canteen, but sweat poured from every part of your body so fast that dehydration was inevitable. There was no bathroom. You used a bucket in the corner, or you just went in the mud. In that heat, in that humidity, dignity was among the first things you lost. Medical issues during shifts were common and ignored. Heat exhaustion caused men to collapse mid-shift. They were dragged to the airlock and sent up. Dehydration made hands shake and vision blur, cuts that wouldn't stop bleeding, nosebleeds from the pressure, vomiting from the combination of heat, exertion, and dense air that made breathing feel like drowning. But if you went up early, you didn't get paid, not for shortened shift, not for medical emergency. Company policy was clear: complete your shift or receive nothing. So men worked through agony, through heat exhaustion, through injuries that should have sent them to a hospital, because going up meant losing wages their families needed to eat. The choice was between your health and your children's survival. That's not really a choice at all. And always, always, there was the fear. The timber above your head creaked constantly, thousands of tons of granite pressed down, supported by wooden beams that were aging, warping, and weakening every day. If the caisson roof failed, you would be crushed so fast you wouldn't feel it. If the walls failed, the river would flood in with the force of a cannon blast, drowning everyone before they could reach the airlocks. Both scenarios had happened in other caisson projects in Europe. The workers knew this because stories spread through immigrant communities. Letters from home told of accidents in London, Paris, Amsterdam. Workers knew the risks. They took the jobs anyway, because knowing the danger and having alternatives are very different things. 6 to 8 hours in hell. Then came the part that terrified experienced workers more than anything else, more than the descent, more than the work, more than the blasting or the heat or the darkness, the ascent. Because coming up too fast didn't just hurt. It killed you in ways doctors couldn't understand. It killed you days after you thought you were safe. It killed you in your sleep while your family watched helplessly, and nobody knew why. Part 4 begins, the bends, when physics kills. In the spring of 1870, when the Brooklyn caisson first reached 40 feet of depth, workers started complaining of joint pain after shifts. Deep, aching pain in knees, elbows, shoulders. Pain that got worse overnight instead of better. Pain that felt, in the words of one worker, like my bones were being twisted from the inside. Company doctors dismissed it as muscle strain. Hard labor caused sore muscles. This was expected. The workers should rest on their day off and return to work. But the men knew this was different. They'd done hard labor their entire lives. They knew what sore muscles felt like. This was something else. The first death came in late May of 1870. His name was John Myers, 28 years old, Irish immigrant. He'd been in America for 2 years and working in the caisson for 3 months. He completed a normal shift at 45 feet of depth, went through decompression without complaint, walked out of the airlock seeming fine, started toward the main gate to go home. 20 steps. That's how far he got. Then his legs stopped working. He tried to stand and fell, tried again and couldn't. He began screaming about pain in his back, pain so severe he couldn't form coherent words. Other workers carried him to the company medical office. He was convulsing, body arching backward, muscles seizing. 30 minutes later, he was dead. The autopsy, such as it was in 1870, concluded cause unknown, possibly stroke. But John Myers was 28 and had been perfectly healthy that morning. Strokes didn't happen to 28-year-old laborers. Something else had killed him, something the doctors couldn't identify. Workers began calling it the bends, because men who developed severe symptoms doubled over in pain, bending forward, unable to straighten their backs. The medical establishment had no explanation. The prevailing theory was bad air or miasma from the contaminated mud. Some doctors suggested the heat caused brain fever. Others blamed poor diet or excessive drinking. None of these theories explained why healthy young men would suddenly collapse hours after leaving work. What was actually happening involved physics that wouldn't be fully understood for another decade. At surface pressure, your blood holds a certain amount of dissolved nitrogen. It's always there, absorbed from the air you breathe, in equilibrium with atmospheric pressure. Under high pressure, like the 35 plus psi inside the caisson, your blood absorbs significantly more nitrogen, the same principle as carbonation in soda. Under pressure, liquid absorbs more gas. This extra nitrogen wasn't dangerous as long as pressure remained high. But when workers ascended and pressure dropped rapidly, the nitrogen couldn't be exhaled gradually through normal breathing. Instead, it came out of solution directly in the bloodstream, forming bubbles. Imagine opening a shaken bottle of soda. The sudden pressure release causes carbon dioxide to fizz out violently. The same thing was happening in workers' blood, except the bubbles were nitrogen, and they were forming inside living tissue. Where the bubbles formed determined the symptoms. Bubbles collecting in joints caused excruciating pain as gas pockets pressed against nerve endings and inflamed tissue. Workers called this the bends because the knee and elbow pain was so severe they couldn't straighten their limbs. Bubbles in the spinal fluid caused paralysis, often starting in the legs and ascending toward the torso. Bubbles in the brain caused seizures, unconsciousness, and death. Bubbles in the heart or lungs caused what workers called the chokes, an inability to breathe that led to cardiac arrest. The symptoms appeared anywhere from 1 to 6 hours after surfacing, though sometimes they manifested almost immediately. Mild cases involved joint pain that intensified over hours to unbearable levels. The pain lasted days to weeks. Some men never fully recovered, developing chronic arthritis that plagued them for life. Severe cases involved paralysis, respiratory distress, neurological symptoms like confusion and blindness, and a death rate around 40% if symptoms included paralysis. But here's what made it truly terrifying. It was random, or seemed random. Not everyone got it. Not every shift caused it. The same worker might be fine one day and paralyzed the next. Variables that affected risk included time at depth, working pressure, decompression speed, individual physiology, age, fitness level, how many previous shifts you'd worked, and whether you'd had the bends before, which dramatically increased your risk of getting it again. None of these variables were understood in 1870. Workers descended into a lottery. Each shift, you gambled your life. Sometimes you won, sometimes you lost. And the stakes were permanent disability or death. Washington Roebling observed the patterns and implemented changes. He slowed decompression from 5 minutes to 15 or 20 minutes. He shortened shifts from 8 hours to 4. He tried rotating workers so the same men weren't working consecutive days. He ordered medical screening to disqualify workers with obvious health issues. These measures helped. The rate of serious cases declined slightly, but they didn't eliminate the problem, and every improvement came with company resistance because slower decompression and shorter shifts meant reduced productivity. The impossible choice faced the entire operation. Fast decompression meant higher bends risk, but more excavation progress. Slow decompression meant lower risk, but slower progress and higher costs. The decision was made by company executives who never went down into the caisson and never felt nitrogen bubbles forming in their blood. The consequences were borne by workers who had no say in the decision and no choice but to accept it. The documented cases are heartbreaking in their detail. Frank Harris, age 34. 6 months on the job, experienced sandhog, well respected by his crew. He worked a shift at 65 feet depth for 4 hours. Underwent normal decompression, 15 minutes. Walked home, ate dinner with his wife and 3 children. 2 hours later, he complained of severe knee pain. 4 hours later, he couldn't walk. His wife summoned a doctor who gave him laudanum for pain but had no other treatment. 24 hours later, Frank Harris was paralyzed from the waist down. He never walked again. He continued working for the bridge company, doing paperwork in the office for $1 per day, less than half his previous wages. His family struggled. His children left school to work. He died in 1898 at age 56 of complications from old injuries. There was no pension, no ongoing company support. His widow received nothing. William Reardon, age 22. New worker, only his third shift ever. He worked at 70 feet depth for 6 hours because the foreman needed to make quota. He came up reporting a severe headache. The doctor gave him laudanum and sent him home. His roommates found him dead the next morning. The autopsy showed cerebral hemorrhage. What really happened was gas bubbles in his brain caused a stroke. He was 22 years old. His family in Ireland received a letter informing them of his death and a company check for $50. That was the entire compensation for their son's life. In December of 1870, an entire shift of 12 men experienced severe bends afterward. 4 were hospitalized. 1, Thomas O'Malley, age 41, died. Investigation revealed that the decompression valve had malfunctioned. Pressure dropped in 3 minutes instead of 15. The sudden decompression flooded all their bloodstreams with nitrogen bubbles simultaneously. The company response was to classify it as equipment failure, unfortunate accident. The workers' response was a 3 days work stoppage, extremely rare in that era. The strike ended when the company hired replacement workers and threatened to fire anyone who didn't return immediately. And then there was Washington Roebling himself. Washington spent more time in the caisson than almost anyone. He supervised, he inspected. He worked alongside the crews because he believed a chief engineer should understand every aspect of the work. Between 1870 and 1872, he accumulated a massive nitrogen load in his tissues from hundreds of descents. In May of 1872, he suffered a severe attack, paralysis, speech impairment, chronic pain that never fully resolved. He survived, but was permanently disabled. For the remaining 11 years of bridge construction, he directed work from his bedroom window in Brooklyn Heights, watching through a telescope while his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, became the de facto chief engineer. She learned advanced mathematics and engineering to relay his instructions to the site supervisors. Without Emily Roebling, the bridge might never have been completed, but that's another story. The cruel irony was that Washington Roebling lived another 54 years after the bridge opened, dying in 1926 at age 89. He spent those decades in chronic pain, partially paralyzed, suffering the effects of nitrogen bubbles that had formed in his tissues over a century and a half ago. The bridge he built outlived him. The damage it caused him never healed. The medical breakthrough came too late for the Brooklyn Bridge workers. In 1878, French physician Paul Bert published La pression barométrique, identifying nitrogen as the culprit and recommending staged decompression with pressure stops to allow gas to leave the body gradually. By the time his work was widely known, both Brooklyn caissons had reached bedrock and been sealed. The final toll from the Brooklyn caisson was at least 110 workers with documented serious cases of the bends. 5 confirmed deaths directly attributed to decompression sickness during construction. Dozens more probably died of natural causes that were actually unrecognized bends. The number of permanent disabilities is unknown because men didn't report injuries if they wanted to keep working. Washington Roebling suffered effects for the remaining 54 years of his life, and how many workers developed chronic issues years later, dying young of complications that stemmed from those shifts in the darkness 70 feet below the East River? We'll never know. History didn't care enough to track them. Part 5 begins: completion, legacy, and the cost. By late 1872, the Brooklyn caisson finally reached bedrock at 44.5 feet below the riverbed. The New York side caisson, started later and plagued by similar issues, reached bedrock at 78.5 feet in 1873. Both chambers were filled with concrete, sealed forever, and construction moved upward. The towers rose, the cables were strung, the deck took shape. The bridge that had killed and crippled hundreds began to look like the masterpiece John Roebling had envisioned. Opening day was May 24, 1883. 13 years of construction. Over 150,000 people crossed on the first day. President Chester A. Arthur walked across with New York Governor Grover Cleveland and Brooklyn Mayor Seth Low. There were fireworks, celebrations, speeches celebrating human achievement and American engineering prowess. Newspapers around the world covered it. Headlines called it the greatest engineering achievement of the century and the eighth wonder of the world. What the newspapers didn't mention were the men buried beneath it. What the speeches didn't acknowledge was the human cost of granite and steel. The celebrations happened above, while 70 feet below, sealed in concrete. Inside wooden chambers that would last centuries were the tools left behind, the work boots abandoned, the personal items dropped and forgotten, and possibly the remains of workers whose bodies were never recovered from accidents, entombed forever in the foundations. Every time someone walks across the Brooklyn Bridge, they're walking on a tomb. Washington Roebling lived until 1926, reaching age 89. He spent the remaining 44 years of his life post-bridge dealing with chronic pain, partial paralysis that improved slightly but never fully resolved, and the knowledge that the structure that made him famous had also destroyed his health. He became reclusive, spending his time studying mineralogy and learning foreign languages. He watched his son continue the family engineering legacy, and he watched the bridge endure season after season, year after year, exactly as his father had designed it. In 1890, during an interview, he said, "The bridge cost me my health, but it stands." That was his legacy, his health in exchange for immortality in stone and steel. The sandhogs who survived faced different fates. Many continued in construction, moving to tunnel work, foundation excavation, any job that required working in compressed air or dangerous conditions. They were the only ones with experience, so they were in demand. Some helped form early labor unions, contributing to what would eventually become the International Union of Operating Engineers. Those who were disabled found work as security guards, clerks, anything that could be done sitting down. Many drank heavily. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't recognized as a medical condition until the 1980s, but the symptoms were there. Dreams of the caisson, waking up in the night feeling pressure on their chest, the sound of creaking timber that wasn't there. Frank Harris, the worker who was paralyzed from the waist down, continued working in the bridge company, office until 1898. He died at 56 of complications from old injuries. His obituary mentioned his bridge work in a single sentence. There was no pension, no ongoing company support beyond the $1 per day wages he earned for paperwork. His family fundraised for his medical care. He spent the last 26 years of his life in a wheelchair because he'd gone to work one morning and his body absorbed too much nitrogen. The families left behind by workers who died received minimal death benefits, typically between $50 and $200, depending on the circumstances. There was no ongoing support, no workers' compensation system, because that wouldn't exist until 1911. Widows remarried quickly out of economic necessity. Children went to work young to replace their father's income. The psychological toll on these families was never discussed, never treated, never acknowledged. Their suffering was collateral damage in the march of progress. But did anything actually change? In the immediate aftermath, some other caisson projects used slower decompression based on the Brooklyn Bridge experience. Medical understanding of decompression sickness improved gradually. Some bridges switched to different foundation methods entirely, using cofferdams instead of caissons when possible, but there were no legal requirements, no regulations, just voluntary adoption by companies that chose to prioritize safety. Many didn't. The longer-term changes came slowly. Workers' compensation laws began appearing in the early 1900s, with New York passing comprehensive legislation in 1910. Industrial safety regulations emerged piecemeal. Decompression tables were developed scientifically over the 1910s and 20s. Recompression chambers, which could treat the bends by repressurizing victims and allowing controlled decompression, were invented and deployed. But the real driver wasn't compassion. It was economics. Lawsuits became expensive. Strikes became common. Worker deaths slowed projects and attracted negative publicity. Companies discovered that preventing injuries was cheaper than dealing with the consequences. Safety became profitable, so safety improved. The moral argument had been made for decades. The economic argument finally won. Modern regulations from OSHA, established in 1970, created strict requirements for hyperbaric work. Decompression schedules are legally mandated based on depth and time. Medical monitoring is required. Dive computers calculate safe ascent rates automatically. recompression chambers must be on site for major underwater construction projects. The difference is stark. A modern caisson worker has a 95% plus safety rate. In the 1870s, the injury rate was over 50%. The bridge still stands. It's still functional. Over 120,000 vehicles cross it daily. 4,000 pedestrians walk across every day. It's an icon of New York, featured in countless films, photographs, and paintings. Tourists walk it for the views of Manhattan and the harbor. They see graceful cables swooping between granite towers. They see the skyline. They see history and beauty. What they don't see is the wooden tomb 70 feet below the water. What they don't think about is the men who couldn't whistle because the air was too thick, who sweated in 110-degree heat for 8 hours straight, who dug sewage-contaminated mud by hand while thousands of tons of granite pressed down inches above their heads, who climbed back up only to discover that ascending was deadlier than descending. There is a memorial plaque installed in 1983 for the bridge's 100th anniversary. It lists 27 names of workers who gave their lives during construction, but it only lists deaths that occurred during the construction period itself. It doesn't include the Benz deaths that occurred days, weeks, or years later. It doesn't include the chronic injuries. It doesn't include Washington Roebling, who survived but spent 54 years suffering the effects. The true cost is unknowable because most of the victims weren't considered worth recording. Modern caisson work still exists. The Golden Gate Bridge used them. The Akashi Kaikyo Bridge in Japan used them. The Öresund Bridge connecting Denmark and Sweden used them. But the difference between modern caisson work and the Brooklyn Bridge is the difference between surgery and butchery. Modern workers descend knowing the physics, knowing the risks, protected by regulations written in the blood of men, like John Myers and Frank Harris and William Reardon. They surface safely because we finally learned that time cannot be rushed, that physics demands respect, and that human lives are worth more than construction schedules. The question of whether it was worth it has no good answer. The utilitarian argument says, yes, 100 deaths, even 500 deaths, to create a structure that has benefited millions of people over 140 years. The math works. The bridge enabled massive economic growth. It connected 2 cities into 1 metropolis. It inspired engineering innovation worldwide. 100 deaths to serve millions. From a purely numerical standpoint, the cost seems justified. But every single one of those deaths was preventable. Slower progress would have saved them. Better decompression protocols, shorter shifts, more frequent medical screening. None of these measures were impossible. None were beyond the technology of the time. What they required was patience and a willingness to prioritize lives over timelines. The deaths didn't happen because they were unavoidable. They happened because companies calculated that worker lives were cheaper than construction delays. The families who lost fathers, sons, and brothers didn't benefit from utilitarian mathematics. Anna Myers, widow of John Myers, didn't console herself with the thought that millions would use the bridge. She raised their 3 children alone on the $50 death benefit the company provided. Frank Harris's children left school to work because their father could no longer walk. These weren't statistics. They were people whose lives were destroyed so that others could cross a river slightly faster. The real legacy of the Brooklyn Bridge caissons isn't the bridge itself. The real legacy is what we learned, slowly and at tremendous cost. We learned that pressure kills in invisible ways, that decompression sickness is real, understandable, and preventable. We learned that time cannot be rushed when physics is involved, that economic pressure kills when it drives timelines, that workers who report danger must be heard because they know things engineers in offices don't, that monuments are built on graves, and celebrating the beauty while ignoring the blood is incomplete history. But we didn't learn these lessons immediately. It took another 50 years for comprehensive safety regulations. It took 100 years to truly value worker life over progress. We learned the lessons slowly, disaster by disaster, death by death, until the accumulated weight of suffering finally outweighed the profit motive. Today, tourists walk the Brooklyn Bridge taking selfies. Couples kiss at the center span. Children run across the wooden planks laughing. Street musicians play. Nobody thinks about what's beneath their feet. Nobody thinks about the darkness 70 feet down where wooden chambers sit sealed in concrete, holding the tools and boots and maybe bones of men who descended and never came up. The Brooklyn Bridge is beautiful. It deserves to be celebrated. It's an engineering marvel and a testament to what human beings can achieve when they push the boundaries of possibility. But celebration without remembrance is incomplete. When you walk across that bridge, you're walking on the work of men who couldn't whistle because the air was too thick, men who sweated in hellish heat for hours on end, men who dug mud by hand while granite towers rose above them, men who climbed back up only to die days later from physics they couldn't understand. John Myers, William Reardon, Thomas O'Malley, Frank Harris, Washington Roebling, and hundreds more whose names were never recorded because history decided they weren't important enough to remember. They descended into darkness so the bridge could stand. They endured the unbearable so others could cross the river in comfort. They gave their health, their bodies, and their lives. The bridge stands because they descended. The bridge endures because they endured. The bridge connects because they connected human effort to bedrock through mud, pain, and physics that would take decades to fully understand. Every safety regulation we have today was written in someone's blood. Decompression tables exist because men died from the bends. Workers' compensation exists because widows and children were left destitute. OSHA standards exist because companies prioritize profit over safety until forced to change. These protections didn't appear because anyone thought they were morally right. They appeared because enough people died that even the economic calculation finally shifted. The next time you see an iconic structure, ask yourself, who built this? What did it cost them? And did they have a choice? Because beneath every monument to human achievement, there's almost always a story like this one. A story of people who descended into danger because they had families to feed, who trusted that the people making decisions valued their lives, and who learned, too late, that in the calculation of 19th century engineering, labor was cheaper than time. The Brooklyn Bridge is a triumph of engineering, but it's also a tomb. Remember both.